Hello. Okay. Um,
And go for it.
all right. Thanks. So the paper's title is The Effects of Ants on Pest Control. It's a meta-analysis. So for anyone who might not know what that means, that basically means the researchers for this looked at kind of the corpus of papers available and then drew conclusions about their hypothesis from that. um, and then presented the results in a paper that's kind of like a summary um, of the effects that they were trying to prove or disprove. So the basic idea behind this paper, um, or I guess you could start with the why, is that humans are looking for better ways to farm. Because right now we use a lot of pesticides to control things that we don't like from eating our crops. Though that method is problematic for a variety of reasons, but two of the main reasons are it's bad for human health and it's bad for environmental health. Um, it's also expensive and not sustainable. Um, Kind of a new approach to farming has begun to be more explored in the mainstream, and that's sustainable farming methods. Um, so it's kind of the idea that you use things that are already naturally in the environment to help manage, modify, and make better your farming systems. And I say farming systems and not just fields and crops because it's kind of taking a more um, sys- systematic and holistic approach to managing food production. So one of I'm going to paraphrase one person who I really like in this field. His name is Mark Shepard. He says sustainable farmers are in the business of engineering, designing, and managing ecosystems, not just growing crops and plants. Um, so for this paper, the researchers wanted to explore the effect of ants on pest, on pests, plant growth, plant health, and crop yield are the main categories that they're examining. And they wanted to know what sort of beneficial effects ants have on plants. They use the terms services and disservices throughout the paper to describe positive and negative effects of ants on the crop yield and the other stuff that they wanted to know about. Their sample size was about I think it was like 1,000. It was like 2,000 papers, but they whittled it down to about 52. Um, Using criteria that excluded papers that were not relevant or didn't have quite the data they were looking for to be able to do a good comparison. So it was limited down to 52 studies over 17 different crop types. Um, and they wanted to explore this method of, I guess, pest control because it's less work on the part of the farmer. Um, oh, I may have said that already. My bad. But yeah, it's less work on the part of the farmer. It's healthier for the ecosystem because you're using things and organisms that are naturally there already, and it reduces production cost and food cost. So you get a cheaper product at the end, hopefully. Um, Using ants to control pest populations for plants that you want to grow is not a new idea. The paper links to evidence that Chinese farmers used this technique centuries ago, utilizing ants manage and to manage pests. Um, and then over like time, other cultures have done it too. So people who farm in Kenya, Canada, Ghana, Nigeria, to name a few, there's more linked in the paper of, I guess you could say, cultures that use ants to control pests. Um, Despite the reoccurrence of this method and approach, it's very far from being a solved problem. One of the one of the most challenging aspects of it is finding the right ants that pair with the crops that you're trying to grow. Um, so ants by def if you don't have the right ants paired with your crops, you can get negative effects. And the paper goes on to list one of those is like, or several of those are the ants can spread pathogens that are bad for your plants or bad for pollinators. They can also increase honeydew producing pests. So those are things like aphids and mealybugs. Um, they can reduce the abundance of pollinators, and they can also reduce how many enemies to like the naturally occurring pests normally like fly around and hang out around the plants. So basically, if the ants have a monopoly on your ecosystem, it's probably not going to be that balanced because you're going to have other problems. The ants kind of behave like a mafia if they're not kept in balance and part of a healthy working ecosystem. Um, More aggressive ant species are usually the larger ones, according to the paper. And those are the ones that are, they can more effectively like reduce um, pest populations, but they also kind of chase off other beneficial organisms that you might want hanging around your plant. And ants farm like aphids and honeydew producing insects. So you're going to get more of that too, which might not necessarily be what you're looking for when you're trying to hold crop yield to be high and keep your crops healthy. Um, We've had many, or the authors state that they've had many other papers that have examined um, tests that exclude ants from the farm entirely. Um, but they say that the results from those tests are kind of inconclusive because of the length of the tests. And if you think about it, it kind of makes sense because um, you're not just looking at like 1 or 2 weeks of ants being in a monocrop cornfield, right? Forming and changing ecosystems takes time, sometimes on the order of like human lifetime, sometimes even longer than that. So it's kind of hard to get really good data about uh, how not having ants really affects your crops, especially too because you're changing out crops like throughout the season and stuff. And with monocrops, you could be digging up and like destroying a lot of the soil infrastructure that's there, and you're basically messing with what's trying to grow constantly because you're swapping it out for new and different things as a farmer. So that could also affect how well the ants establish their colony. Um, so some of the criteria they looked at when they were sorting through papers were like the body length of ants, what are the most abundant species, um, what type of pests do they manage? So are they honeydew producing pests or other species? Um, the group that the pests are in, their taxonomic level, their natural enemy specialization, um, the dispersal type, which is like how the pests get around, whether they're winged or wingless, they crawl, or if they fly around. Um, in addition, they also evaluated whether ants, um, the effect that ants had was changed by the field size, the crop system, which is like if it's monoculture, intercropped, or shaded crops, and the experiment duration, so like how long they let the ants hang out in the field and do their thing. Um, so I'm not gonna go over the um, statistics too heavily because I don't understand them too well. But basically, they use statistical models to examine papers, and they it looks like they did methods to kind of exclude random chance, um, and kind of ensure that what they're testing for is actually having a effect on what they're trying to measure. Um, so, does anyone have any questions at this point? No one? Okay. So I guess I'll kind of skip ahead to the kind of conclusion and what they concluded. Um, so they determined a couple of things. Their results kind of supported the hypothesis that ants are kind of good for plant growth. The beneficial effects that they have are more pronounced in shaded crops. So that's like when you have woody plants growing with your crops, as well as crops that grow in the ground. Um, there was less of a pronounced effect for things like monocultures. So you didn't quite get as many benefits there. Um, Sometimes it was kind of required for them to move colonies in if there's not an existing like ant colony living around doing its thing. Uh, and then other times they kind of had to work with the ants that were already there. But the types of ants that you plant in can have a huge outcome, or can affect the outcome of whether or not it's beneficial or not to the crops that you're trying to grow. And yeah, that's basically the paper. Um, so if anyone has any questions or discussions or is curious about like how this could affect sustainable agriculture and agricultural practices in the future, I would appreciate it if you would voice your ideas, concerns, thoughts.
Mhm.
Okay, so let me ask this then. Is anyone here at least a little bit curious about like ants and their effect on like agriculture and stuff? It kind of feels like I'm the only one because you guys are all kind of quiet.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, I was trying to ask, do they mention or are there any papers that mention viable methods for starting ant colonies, like a beekeeping situation?
No. So this paper was kind of I don't want to say preliminary, but it was kind of examining whether or not this would be something worth, I guess, devoting more effort into researching and examining. And the answer for that is basically yes, because it looks like you get really beneficial outcomes from using ant colonies like this. But as for, I guess like a recipe book for like how to use this method, they didn't really explore that in this paper, as far as I could tell. Um, so Nika posted a question in chat. It was, can ants be used to chase out cockroaches in New York? Um, I don't know. This paper was really um, kind of geared toward exploring ants and pests with crop fields and places where you produce food. Um, I don't think it talked too much about kind of urban living and how to kind of chase out pests there. It's kind of limited to growing and producing food. I hope that answered your question.
It would be interesting if there was any like research into a symbiotic group where it helps the ants grow or something like that.
Um, Sorry, part of that cut out. You said a symbiotic what?
It'd be interesting to see if there were any symbiotic equivalents to the cordyceps mushroom that would help the ants grow instead of kill them.
Oh, yeah, I didn't really see anything like that mentioned in the paper. Like I said, I'm not an expert, but from what I do know about the cordyceps fungus, I don't think it's a something that you'd want around your ants. You're trying to have them do stuff that's good for you. Maybe if it's ants that you don't like.
You did mention some of the more aggressive species will chase out beneficial insects, so I wonder if there's a feedback loop you can set up.
I suspect that there might be kind of some of the things that I've seen listening to people who talk about permaculture and farming and biology in general is that systems are complex and feedback plays a large role in how balanced they are and how resilient they are to change.
This may be an ignorant question, but where do termites fall on the spectrum of ants?
They mentioned termites. Let me check.
Brim also asked a good question in the voice and video chat.
Oh, okay. So for those listening to the recording, it's since ants communicate through chemical signals and all that, do you think controlling them through chemicals would be beneficial to improve different crops based on needs? Um, I remember reading something about, I think it was in this paper actually, some pests that um, kind of mimic ant pheromones in order to not be bothered by the ants. As far as like humans producing pheromones to like control and influence ants, I haven't heard too much research in that aspect. Though I will admit that has been something that's been on my mind because I was like, think of all the ants you wouldn't have to like kill or put out poison if you could like communicate with them through pheromone or whatnot. But I'm not sure if that's something that I mean, I'm sure somebody's probably researching it, but it's not something that I've come across um, yet. Perhaps I'll look into that. I definitely think it would be interesting.
The papers say that there are some species that use chemical camouflage to avoid ants.
Yep. It sounds about what I read as well. I really like this approach too of like utilizing ants to kind of manage plants because it is beneficial not just for like humans as a species, but also the species we rely on and the species that rely on those species. Um, Humans tend to take a very anthrocentric approach to doing things like food production. Um, and arguably, we have some good reasons for doing that. But it's sometimes problematic because we can throw ecosystems out of whack, and that can cause like cascading and rippling effects that you see throughout other living ecosystems and things that we kind of influence without intending to. Nika posted a comment. They said, I don't think you would be able to directly control them with chemicals. Ants use pheromone trails to go to different points, similar to road trips. Maybe drawing the trips in a different place would lead them elsewhere. Don't know how hard it would be to make ant pheromones in a lab compared to just picking ants up and placing them where you want them. Oh, yeah, that also reminds me. It's kind of funny too. It's almost a side note, but in the paper, the researchers mentioned that in an effort to like kind of get this is in a separate paper that they're referencing, not this paper, but they kind of talked about a farmer, or I imagine a group of researchers trying to see if they could convince the ants not to um, leave too many honeydew pests on the crops by leaving sugar like by the base of trees and plants and stuff. And it didn't work. And also, not only did it not work, the ant colony size shrank and the pest increased. So I thought that that was pretty funny because it's like we're going to bribe the ant mafia with sugar because they're already harvesting like sugar from aphids and stuff, and then it like not only doesn't work, you get like a worse outcome.
Does it say what kind of sugar they use?
um, it's in a mentioned paper that's behind a paywall, I think. So I didn't get a chance to skim over it and read into it too much. But I thought that that was pretty funny. Oh, and I guess kind of to circle back, 'cause that was a bit of a tangent, to Nika's question. I think we do have methods to synthesize some ant pheromones. I know some of the ant traps that I've used. I did a little bit of research into them, and they put specific pheromones into the bait so that the ants are like more likely to come along and pick up the food rather than just like normal foods. But kind of the specifics of that, I didn't really learn too much about because it's kind of hush hush proprietary stuff. But I suspect that we can synthesize some ant pheromones in labs. And it seems to me that if you can kind of encourage them to come to a food source, it would potentially be possible, maybe difficult or not practical, but it seems like it would be potentially possible to make other pheromone signals to direct ants to places. I know Sharpie markers can be used to kind of direct ants to places too. That was an experiment I did in one of my biology classes.
Sharpie markers?
Yeah, it was Sharpie markers and I think specifically black ballpoint pens. They have a chemical in them that mimics an ant pheromone, and so they won't cross like the line. I think it's specifically with black ballpoint pens. Um, but yeah, you can basically draw like a little cage for an ant, So, like, if you draw a circle on a sheet of paper and put the ant in the middle, he'll usually stay inside.
That is really
Um,
cool.
yeah, I thought it was a really neat experiment.
Especially if you wanted to have a colony, you could probably draw out a grid and
Yeah.
encase it in plastic or something.
So did anyone else have any questions or comments? I guess it's a no then. Unless you're still thinking up stuff. All right. Sorry if this was a bit of a short one. I don't really have a lot of experience presenting, so sorry I can't be as fun and entertaining as Gabe is. But I hope you guys all enjoyed this.
Well, I just arrived from school, but I'm sure it was great.
No, thanks for presenting.
No problem. For the new guy that entered, it was a paper on using ants to control pest population for when farming.